guess Kevin doesn't count. So I guess so. I guess he thinks he's not here. So tonight we're going to talk about CocoaPods, and in some ways CocoaPods is not a very exciting topic because it just kind of does grunt work for you. In other ways, it's something that can alleviate a lot of frustration from your life if you are used to doing iOS projects and integrating other people's code. So it's primarily a dependency management tool, and if you work on different platforms, you're probably used to these. If you're doing Java development, you're probably using Maven. If you're doing Ruby development, you're using Ruby Gems and Bundler. And iOS doesn't really have a lot of great tools around this until CocoaPods, in my opinion. And CocoaPods it's pretty young still. It's probably been around less than a year, I think, and at least in terms of regular usage by people. And there's still some warts here and there. Believe it or not, in classic fashion, right before this talk, I was trying to create a new project, and I had the hardest time getting it to work, and I still didn't get it to work. So I guess we'll have to use an old one to demo some of the functionality. So why would you want to use CocoaPods? Well, as developers, what we primarily do is we automate things, right? That's what software really is automation of a process. And it's somewhat interesting that we spend a lot of time doing busy work, or shaving yaks, or whatever you want to call it, when we really could be automating these things that really just get in our way of getting work done each day. So the first reason that we'd want to use CocoaPods is you want to automate everything that you do if you can. And especially something as annoying as dependency management. The other reason you want to use CocoaPods is you want to make your workspace consistent with other developers on your team. If you are trying to share code, not code that you own, but third-party code, people have to set up these linker flags, and they have to set up the header search path, and they have to do all these, pretty annoying and tedious tasks to get it to work properly. And that, just what that does is it invites more time spent configuring Xcode, and everyone knows that that's never a fun time. Lastly, if you're using, this isn't really last, but if you're using a third-party library and you want to get an update for it, well, if you're using a version from a year ago, if it's really hard to upgrade, you're probably not going to do it. And that can mean missing out on new features, it can mean missing out on bugs that get fixed. And we really want to be upgrading whenever we can, because upgrading never really gets cheaper. Dependency resolution. If you use 4 different libraries and they all have their own dependencies, potentially you could have a conflict where one library depends on this version of this other library, and this library depends on a newer one. CocoaPods does some dependency resolution, and potentially can help you solve those kinds of problems and not have to worry about it. And, when I did Java development, everyone hated getting stuck in jar hell, where you're trying to figure out which jars are stomping on each other, causing conflicts with another one, and that's not a good time. The other reason I think this is really valuable, if you have to configure every third-party library you're using, which means you're probably not going to try them out. And with CocoaPods, you could easily just bring in a third-party library, try it out, see how it works, and if you don't like it, it's no loss. You can just reset back to your last Git commit. So those are some of the biggest reasons I would recommend using CocoaPods. If you're not using them right now, you're probably either not using much third-party code, or else you're having a horrible time configuring Xcode. So let's look at let's look at this right here. This is just a stock Xcode project. And let's say that we want to use a library called SS Toolkit. This is by a developer named Sam Sofas, and it's basically a bunch of utility classes he's developed, nice view helpers, stuff like that. And he's a pretty smart guy. You may have seen his app that he did recently called Cheddar, just kind of for fun. And if you look at the requirements to get this thing to work, I mean, you have to, first thing he recommends you do is he says you should curl the source. Well, I don't think I have, I think I did this already, so. So here's the source. And then he wants you to open up Finder and drag the Xcode project into your Xcode, your other Xcode project. So here's my project right here. And he says, oh, you should open up Finder and do this. Okay, I will make this really painful for you so you realize how much better it'd be not to be doing this. And hopefully I won't make any mistakes. So we're going to take this file here, drag it in. Okay, then we have to do, select your main Xcode project from the sidebar, select the target you want to add the toolkit to. Okay, I'll do that. Now I have to go to target dependencies, add the toolkit and toolkit resources from the menu and choose add. And this is for the, yeah, right here. Didn't seem to do what I wanted it to do. Let's make sure I actually have it. Oh, here it is. I made some shortcuts here, so it's a little easier if I make a mistake.
Git stash?
Yeah, you could do that too. There we go. So now I jump forward a few steps here. I dragged in the project. Let's go to build phases, add the target dependencies. This guy here. This guy. Now what's next? Oh, okay, now I have to link the binary with the libraries. So I'm going to add the SS toolkit library, link that, and he says, make sure you're also bringing in Quartz Core and Core Graphics. I think I have Core Graphics for free, so I just have to do Quartz. Okay, now I have to copy and bundle resources. And I'll expand this here so you can see where we're going to pull that from. And click and drag the resources bundle into the copy bundle resources build phase. Okay, did that part. Now I'll go to build settings here, all, and we're going to go to header search paths. And I have to add in vendor SS toolkit. I think that's what he wants you to do. Yep, and then now I have to set up my linker flags. Okay, so if I did everything right, hopefully I can actually use the code now. Now it is possible that you could check in this code with the project and save some of these steps, but then you have the problem of you're kind of like versioning this version of the framework with your code as well, and that makes it harder to update in the future. So it looks like I can actually build. So let's see if I can use the code. Oops, wrong one. I'll drag this out of the way. And I'm going to jump ahead. Well,
Could you bump the font there?
Yeah, I will. Where's it at? Oh, yeah, yeah. Good point.
There we go.
Color change too. Okay, so let's see if we can import a file here from the SS toolkit. Come on. It is. Let's see if this thing is even around to be found. Build failed. Oh man, I did it wrong. Okay, so I'm going to take a shortcut again. All right. So here I imported the header file, and I'm just creating one of his label classes. I don't really care what it does. I'm just showing you, that's how hard it was to get the project in here. Now, if you're using like, 10 or 20 frameworks for your big project, it's ridiculous to even think about doing this for every one of them, right? I mean, there's so many steps. It's so tedious, and here's the usually the label. Just a lot of work. Not to mention that everyone in your team would have to do this if you're not checking all the project settings in, and it's not very repeatable if you want to run on CI. I mean, it's terrible. So we wouldn't, if we're smart, we would say this is a waste of my time. I shouldn't do this. So that's the bad way. You can also do things like I've actually just copied third-party source into my project because that solves a lot of those problems that it's had. Of course, that's assuming the code uses Arc, or if your project's Arc, or it assumes that all these little small settings in Xcode don't go wrong. So these are the two options of static libraries, which I don't think the way that I did it it's considered a static library. That's something different. So instead of this, I would recommend you use CocoaPods. Now, when you run a project in CocoaPods, you actually in some ways have two projects. And the reason I would say that is you have a pod file, which I'll explain in a little bit, which describes the dependencies your project uses. But you also have a gem file, or at least I would recommend that you do. Now, a gem file, all of a sudden we're talking about running Ruby code as well as Objective-C. And for many of us, oops, wrong way, don't want to learn Ruby or don't want to do that. They don't want to learn, we don't have time to do this. We want to ship code, right? Well, the good news is, you probably do want to learn Ruby, and if you don't, you at least can use it, because you really don't have to learn Ruby to use CocoaPods at all. Although you should be somewhat familiar with the environment. But there's so many easy tutorials that show you how to get it running. This really shouldn't be a problem. The other benefits, I think, of bringing Ruby to your ecosystem are, one, there's a lot of great Ruby libraries that really support development in iOS. For example, we use something called Beta Builder, which is a gem, which is a fork of some other implementation. But I can use a tool called Rake, which lets us run tasks from the command line, and I can say Rake staging deploy and type commit notes, and it automatically deploys a staging build, sends it to test flight, and publishes it with 10 keystrokes. And that's really, really convenient. The other reason is the Ruby community is pretty progressive in the sense that they're building a lot of cool tools, and a lot of, when they kind of came from Rails and doing Ruby development, they brought a lot of their ideas with them to iOS world, and they have a lot of neat tools and tricks, and even the coding style starts to come across, and you get this cross-pollination effect, which I think is really valuable, because as developers we can kind of get stuck in a shell and not use tools or techniques that people in other languages use all the time. And plus you also get the benefit of these smart people who just bring another viewpoint. So let's go through a simple usage of CocoaPods, and I'll show you the extent to which you'll have to learn Ruby. Okay,
Hey Peter, would you mind pulling up the bottom of your screen? It's getting all
sure.
cut off on there. Yeah, and then just bring it up. Perfect.
Okay, so let's open up our project structure here. This is like a half-baked Git repo for this presentation, so it's not good yet. I just started working on it. So I kind of did the original project here, and I mentioned the gem file. Let's look at what a gem file looks like. So a gem file, basically, oops, not there. Wrong directory. Okay, so a gem file just specifies the libraries. This is like, Ruby gems is like CocoaPods for Ruby, so it's kind of takes a lot of the same syntax and stuff like that. So all I'm specifying here are that I'm going to use Ruby gems for the source of my gems, which is basically where it's going to download all the libraries from. I'm going to use rake, and I'm going to use CocoaPods. Those are the only dependencies I'm really using here. And rake is a really good, basically a task running library. It's written by Jim Weyrich, who actually lives in Cincinnati, and it ships with every copy of Rails, so it's used by tons of people. And I'm going to specify CocoaPods, and also I'll talk about the syntax when we get to the pod file itself. So pretend that we have done the Ruby environment, tutorial, and let's install that stuff here. So you can see that Ruby gems is going to fetch all of the different libraries that are needed to run these two. Instead of specifying all my dependencies that they depend on, I just have to say, I want this, and it goes and gets everything else for me. Okay. I had some problems with this project I set up earlier, so I'm going to try to blow it away. So let me create an Xcode project. And when I tried this earlier, the strangest thing happened. Doesn't work at all. We'll see what happens right now. If not, I have an old project I can show you. Close the other stuff I don't need. Just a new, regular old project. Single view is fine. Call it pod demo. Put it right here. It's fine. Okay, so if you look here, you can see my pod demo folder, and then that's where the project file is. And this should run, no problem. And let's pretend now that I really want to use AF networking, okay? If you're not familiar with AF networking, it's a kind of like the de facto networking library these days. And it's really useful if you're doing pretty much anything that's beyond a simple, web page request in a web view or something like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify a pod file. And I'll go back to Vim. Come on. Jeez. And in my pod file, I'm going to say that I'm using the iOS platform instead of Mac OS 10. And I'm going to say 6.0. Typing is hard.
You're a little bit to the left.
Oh, okay. Thanks. And I spelled that wrong. Okay, so, and the other thing they want you to do these days is, I think it's Xcode proj, and I think I called it pod demo, pod demo.xcode proj. So this is really all you're supposed to have to specify for a simple pod file. And what CocoaPods is going to do when I do a pod install, it's going to fetch the dependencies that I want, and it's going to create a library called pods, which is just a generic term for it. And it's going to integrate that library into my existing Xcode project file. So it's going to do all the configuration for me that I kind of showed you before, except it's going to bundle all of my libraries together to do that. And I only have one here, but you'll see when you have a lot of them, it's much more useful. So let's see what happens when I run this. And like I said, for some reason I had this bizarre error that I've never had in 7 months of using it, but demo day you do. So I'm going to do a pod install. Originally what you'd have to do is you would have to do a pod setup, but I've already done that. So that's what you do the first time. I think it should be fine if I do it now. Okay. And let's make sure I'm using the right one. Okay, that's good too. And I'm just going to do pod install. Resolving dependencies. It's going to use the default target. And you can see here that it removed the old dependency I had in there, which is SS Toolkit, and it's installing AF networking. And now it says use poddemo.xe workspace. So one of the complaints of CocoaPods is that it kind of tells you you can't use your Xcode project file anymore because it uses an XE workspace file, which I wish I knew more about it from a technical standpoint, but basically what it does is it's a workspace rather than a specific project, which could include, I guess, multiple projects in one workspace. So I'm going to close Xcode, and you can see here if I go into, there's now a, my goodness. Okay, it created the workspace at a higher level. So it's right here. So
merging the project file, or
so the project file actually exists still.
I mean, is it rewriting it every time, or
every time you do a pod install.
yeah. Or is it just tweaking?
So what it's going to do is it's going to create a separate project in a sense that's called pods, or a library called pods. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's going to reassemble it every time you do a pod install if your dependencies change. So let's give this thing a shot. I'm going to say, and there's the Xcode project file from before. So I'm going to say open pod demo.xe workspace. And this is the same problem I had earlier, and I've never had this before, where it says that there's a workspace integrity problem because it's already open, but I don't see it. Okay, there's that one. Let's close them all. Try it again. Same thing. I guess I'll try clean. I don't see why that would work, but okay, so demo fails. Let's go ahead and look at my existing project that uses CocoaPods for one of my clients right now. So you'll see here that the pod file we're using is quite a bit more in depth. So we'll just look at these simple ones here. We're using RESTKit, and we're just specifying RESTKit, each of its subspecs, they're called, as dependencies. So if you have a really big library you're using, you can choose to use subsets if they define them in that way. So
define them that way.
yeah, yeah. So let's look at what the project looks like when we're using pods. Okay, so you'll see here that pods is like a separate project completely. And that's why it's the XE workspace file, because we really have two of them there. Yeah, I'm really sorry I keep going off the screen here. So there's a few things of interest. You can see if I go to the pods folder or group, you can see all of the libraries and actually you can probably see all the source and everything that is pulled down during that CocoaPods install, the pod install. And I'll, just for posterity's sake, I'll do it here. I can blow away everything in pods, because if I look in pods now, it pulls down all of my source for all the libraries there. I can blow it away. I might regret this, but
What could go wrong?
yeah, no kidding. So we'll close Xcode again. And now I'm going to say pod install. And we'll do, no, we won't do verbose, probably way too much. So it's going to look at my pod file. It's going to tell me that CocoaPods is an update. And you'll see that it's doing something called fetching a pod spec. For a few of these, I didn't use the centralized repo. So now it's installing all of my dependencies.
So does CocoaPods have a centralized repository? Does that say anything?
Yeah, yep.
GitHub.
Yeah, it's on GitHub, but it's a GitHub repo called specs. And you can actually do some really cool things with the pod command. You can actually search for something at the command line, and it'll use that repo. So I can search for, I don't know, name a library that you use. I can search for Facebook or something. So it says, oh, there's 3 Facebook libraries out there. I mean, one of them is obviously the official one. The other ones are someone else's ideas. Yeah, let's look at that master repo. You can actually clone this yourself if you want to play around with it. When it started out, there wasn't many specs out there, so a lot of times you wouldn't find your library that you really wanted to use. Nowadays, there's like tons and tons of them because CocoaPods has really become so much more popular. Chances are, if you are using it or want to use it, it's out there. And I'll show you how you can create your own in a little bit. So anyway, we installed CocoaPods here, and CocoaPods is doing some really cool stuff here. It actually will install AppleDoc for you for the libraries and put them into your document manager if it's set up correctly, which I think it is here. You can see that it encountered an error here and on a couple other ones. So yeah, let's open up our workspace file again. So I have full source, so I can debug and put breakpoints in all of my third-party source. I have frameworks here in pods that you specify as being dependent on. Most of the pod specs, which I'll show you, deal with this. Like they're doing the job of specifying the framework. Like when I pulled an SS toolkit, it said, "Oh yeah, bring in Quartz Core too." Well, this will do it for you. You don't have to worry about that. And pods, I set it up to create 3 different library binaries. And if you look at the pod file I'm using, I have this is kind of the generic, this is the regular target one. And then I have 2 other targets specified. I have specs and I have integration. Well, the cool thing about this is, if you want to use Kiwi in your project for doing unit testing, you don't want to install Kiwi and use it as part of your regular code that you ship and the binary that goes out. You want to only use it when you're running tests. Well, you can target pods to install only against a specific target in your main application. So I can say I'm using the target specs and I want to install Kiwi and I'm using Magical Record for some core data testing here. Same thing when I'm running integration tests. I want to use KIF, which is a integration testing tool, and that will only be targeted for the integration builds. And you can see here those 3 libraries that get built as a result of that. And it will link these automatically. So if I go into my project here, I have my different targets. And I have, where's it at? Build phases, I guess. Target dependencies. Where's the other one? Link binary. So there's live pods integration for my KIF target, which runs integration tests. If I go to specs, you'll see live pod specs, and that's set up for you, which is really, really handy. So there's some more advanced config you can do with CocoaPods. this is a generated file, thankfully. But you can, and the pod specs, which I probably should show you one of them. Let's look at the AF networking one. So these pod specs are basically how CocoaPods knows to deal with the third-party framework. So if there isn't a pod spec out there, you can write your own, and there's docs on how to do it. And they're pretty, some of it is really obvious, like the name, you know, the version. You have to have version libraries for CocoaPods. There's a summary, there's a home page, there's all kinds of stuff here. And this is where it gets really interesting. You can specify your pod as requiring Arc, okay? And the deployment target, other frameworks that it depends on, like mobile core services and system configuration. And you can actually, and then in line, you can specify your precompiled header requirements. So if you have ever used code that, let's say you're using a project that's Arc, but there's a third-party library you really want to use still, and it's not Arc, that's really annoying. You can go ahead and set the flags to do it yourself, or you can just use the CocoaPod spec, which does the configuration for you and says, oh, this isn't Arc. I know how to set those flags accordingly. And these files that I showed you here, these are basically the aggregate of the pod specs requirements for your dependencies. So it knows how to set up the header search paths. It knows how to specify other frameworks that it's dependent on. Like, for example, here, this we require courts and system configuration, core data, all that kind of stuff. And it will set up the Arc flags. All those annoying things you hate to do in Xcode will basically be done for you. Yeah. So there has been, I've had some issues with CocoaPods. Of course, today's isn't that fun either with the demo problems I had, but a lot of them have been smoothed out. There are some problems I've had with libraries, like the pod spec isn't written very well because, you know, people write these, and if they're not 100% correct or they're outdated, I've had problems building some libraries. I've figured out a lot of the problems myself, and sometimes it's been too much. I've just had to kind of give up and hope that it, you know.
That's executable Ruby, right?
Yeah, this is just Ruby code. I mean, it's really just creating one object, a pod spec here, and then just setting properties on it, right?
But if you use the pod spec without reading it, it could be malicious, right? Theoretical. Not likely.
I mean, just like any third-party code you use every day, I guess.
I mean, but it's not it's not like a config file. It's going to be random code.
I mean, it's true that this is Ruby code, but I'm not sure how I'm not sure they may have set up the DSL that they're using here, the domain-specific language, so that it's only like, you know, this file has to produce a certain object of this type, and I'm not sure they could just inject anything, but I really don't know enough about the security ramifications.
I mean, it wouldn't keep you from using it.
Yeah. Let me show you the xcconfig files too. Oh, that's what I'm showing you right now. I'll show you a couple things more when you're configuring your CocoaPods that you might want to use. So I was using this AWS iOS SDK recently on GitHub. And there is a spec for it out there, and I could not get it to work at all. And there's issues a lot of times for these things. Like if I search for AWS, I might find one. And people talk about, you know, this pod isn't configured correctly and whatever. And they said it was fixed, but I could not get it to work for me at all. So I played around with, I actually went into the source and just tried setting like some different libraries that need to be imported, header files that need to be imported in the precompiled header, and I got it to work. So what I did is I created my own local, well, it's not really local, I created my own copy of the pod spec, because you can override, these are all defaulting and going out to the pod specs repo. So I just created a gist right here that I tweaked it, and I basically wrapped my precompiled header imports of Amazon Logger and Error Handler with Foundation, and for some reason that fixed it, and I wish I knew more of why that was the problem. But I've kind of created my own forked version of this, and I just threw it up in a repo so you can access it from the network. Another thing that we've done is we're using a proprietary framework, and you know, we can't really like put it up on GitHub because it's not ours to distribute. And it's really just a local file system, type thing that we're doing. It's just code there. You can specify a local pod, and you can just point to the folder, and it will actually install right from there. I mean, that's like really, really handy. It's much better than a Git submodule.
So if you wanted to play around with a library and fiddle with it, that's what you'd do probably?
Yeah, I probably would. I mean, that's because my project file it's not cluttered with all these other third-party libraries. I have one library. You saw how much, if you followed the instructions for bringing an SS toolkit, it kind of like polluted your project folder file. And if you have like 20 libraries, it's going to take up a lot of space and just be annoying to look at. With pods, you really just have one. So, yeah, you can optionally specify versions. So let's say I wanted like this version had a really bad bug, because by default it's going to go for the newest one that's like stable. I think it uses semantic versioning, so it'll just pick up the latest and greatest. But let's say that I really needed, for whatever reason, 0.91. So I could do that instead. And you can also use some of the more like pessimistic versioning thing. You can use the little squiggly line to do that.
Anything but.
What's that?
You can say anything but this version.
Yeah, you can do stuff like that. So now I'm bringing 091. So I mean, I can upgrade my libraries with just basically changing the version and running pod install, as opposed to, if they add any different settings with their library the old way, you'd have to go back in and configure Xcode and bring down the new files, and it's really just a maintenance headache. So, any questions or?
Yeah. So you alluded to it earlier. You talked about Git and how these libraries weren't actually getting put in your Git repo. How is Git being? How are you telling Git not to?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So what I did, and I'll jump over here.
Ways I can think of to do it.
Yeah. Well, so when you run pod install, okay, it will. Let's see what we have here. So there's this directory called pods. Okay, which is like where all the source gets pulled down into, and the project itself gets built. Pods.xcodeproj. And what I do is in my git ignore, I just add the entire pods directory. Okay. So none of the source is going to get pulled down. I mean, the dependencies are going to be there, right? But I would just assume, like most other, like Maven would do this too, right? You probably wouldn't check in all of your libraries and binaries. You would specify your dependencies, and as part of your workspace setup, you would pull those down.
Okay.
So,
but your XC workspace file actually is in Git.
Yes, that is, yes. So the pods binary itself, or the pods library, is going to get checked in. Okay. Because the code has to be there to run. So when you.
But the repository, you do that.
Yeah, I wouldn't check in.
Directory was, right?
Yeah. There's the pods directory itself, which is where it dumps everything.
Mm-hmm. Do they have the concept of a shared repository, where you could have a shared pod somewhere on your local machine, or? I was just thinking amazing what you do.
Oh, like internal, you mean?
You can clone.
I'm just curious. I mean, I don't have any real questions. I'm just.
Yeah, you could do that, because the specs are just a file, right? It's just a centralized way to hold them, so you can bring them down, and you can.
No, I guess what I was asking is, if I include AF networking, for instance, I got 6 projects, and I'm going to have a copy of AF networking in 6 places. Right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and that's okay. But that's.
You probably, I don't know if they support that or not. I have always kind of been in the every project downloads all of its dependencies camp, and that doesn't bother me.
I'm just saying, sometimes if you're behind, I
yeah.
know.
It seems like you could use the local thing to point to a shared location.
Probably not working on
to.
Yeah.
I was thinking of some gargantuan project I was on before where we did Maven in multiple levels. It was, to be honest, it was a pain in the butt. So
yeah.
I'm asking you how you do the pain in the butt stuff, and I don't really care, so I'll quit asking.
Anyone else, have you guys used CocoaPods at all, or have any experiences with them?
Yeah, I've converted most of my projects to CocoaPods.
Yeah.
And usually it takes me about half an hour at most.
Yeah, we definitely encountered a decent bit of pain. Like this was 9 months ago, And it was pretty painful at times to use CocoaPods, and it's gotten a lot better. They've improved the library a lot since then. And it was worth it, although there was times where we felt like it wasn't worth it just because we couldn't get one thing working. But now it saves us time every single day now. There was the one-time setup costs for us, and hopefully it won't be as bad nowadays.
So if you're converting an existing project, you have to strip out all those libraries from the existing one, right? And then let the pod.
I mean, you wouldn't, I suppose you could use them side by side, but.
I mean, you'd want to, right?
Yeah.
If I'm going to take.
You could just use it for new things only if you wanted.
Anytime that you're trying to do ARC and there's a library that doesn't, like trying to juggle that, is just,
Yeah.
I spend more time trying to get that configured right than I would converting to CocoaPods.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably like anything. Once you waste your time converting one, the next one goes much easier.
Yeah. My experience is I worked on a project and then used some, like 2 source files that I found on the internet once for this, it was like a UI alert view with a block that you could pass it. And I came back to the project a year later, and there was no way I was going to go out and try to find the updates. So I was just like, if it works, I'm just going to ship it with these. With CocoaPods, hopefully you can get around that pain just by, running pod install and you're good to go, and fingers crossed everything works.
So just as a matter of practice, if you found code out there that you wanted to use that wasn't written in a pod spec, would you go to the bother of creating your own local pod for it?
I would probably actually create a pod spec and publish it to the repo.
You would do something like that?
I would try to, yeah. I've never...
I've done that before. You just do a pull request, and
Yep.
they normally take it. They don't really care, and they give you commit access.
Yeah.
It's not scary, but
they've...
yeah.
I think they've locked it down a little bit since then.
Okay.
Because I think you still do get commit access, but they definitely have the whole thing now about contributing to the master repo and
I hope
some.
one that I put out there wasn't one of the ones that screwed you up earlier.
Yeah, I don't think so.
All right, good.
They have a lint command now that validates the specification.
They being CocoaPods.
Yeah. And they say you have to have a version library, even if it just requires a tag with semantic versioning.
So using AF networking, because that's kind of a nicely laid out project. He has his pod spec in his GitHub account.
Yes.
And that same pod spec gets pulled into CocoaPods repository.
I don't know. Well, I'm sure it does. I'm sure it's just a referential integrity thing, like a foreign key pointer to the pod spec. This is
I guess I'm just thinking, who's responsible.
I'm guessing that he is.
Yeah, he decides version 11 is out or whatever.
Yeah.
It definitely tends to be a lag between when a new version comes out and when the pod spec is available.
Especially if the author's not using CocoaPods.
Yeah.
If they're using CocoaPods, then
they usually take care.
And I'm guessing sometimes someone else is asked to put it into the repo for them or something.
Well, to be honest, for existing projects, I don't usually go out and update if it's working. And I don't see anything new that I care about. I just use whatever I had before.
Well, that's what I was saying is I've done that too, but you do miss out on stuff when you do that. You wouldn't do that for most other languages. It just seems like the pain of an Objective-C is so strong that we've always just avoided it.
It's also the nature of not all, but a lot of the iOS projects are not the throwaway, but they're almost temporary things. Right?
Yeah. I mean,
things change so fast, and you almost write a new one.
Yeah.
Not for everything.
I think it's settling down in some respects. I mean, I felt that way too, but I think that if anything, just speaks to the immaturity of the platform, and as it's gotten, been around a bit longer, that's a little longer running. So that's basically the presentation. I wish I had a more comprehensive demo app that was actually working right, that I could play around with more. That's on the to-do list, I guess. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, only other thing, the challenge that we had at work was trying to get it to work behind the firewall. And partially that's because a lot of the specs have the Git protocol instead of HTTPS. I think somebody went in and cleaned up most of that. Hopefully they continue to keep it clean. And it does give you a warning now if you don't use HTTPS. But there's a couple hoops you got to jump through to get it work behind the firewall.
I remember having the same problems with Maven though in some environments. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Problems.
Okay, well I think that's it for me. I'll try to clean up my slides a little bit and my app and see if I can get that working better and publish it, and I'll tweet about it and stuff like that. It might not be for a week or so, but I'll get it out there. So thanks for listening. You're welcome to eat more food and hang out.
On this topic
yeah,
in Chicago.
yeah, I'm going to greatly improve my presentation and go to Chicago and talk at CocoaConf on this. So yeah, it should be fun.
Thanks, Peter.
Great job.
Thanks. And if anyone wants to play foosball, I would be very excited about that.
Before we do that, I'm talking to a few people, and some new, some not, have new apps out. We got to at least go around if you got something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't have anything, but I'd like to hear what everybody else has.
Well, I heard from James already. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I,
You want to? You can show us if you want to.
sure.
Show and tell.
Well, yeah, I mean, I come here and find out what everybody else is doing, too.
Well, what James is setting up, I've got a request, a favor to ask. One of the biggest values of this group is help strengthen the community. So when somebody releases an app, anything you can do to get the word out can go a long way. Individually, we have small networks, but combined, it's a big network. So help folks out and get the word out.
Yeah, Wi-Fi password is in various little